Class, it's Miss Roberts here, and today we're going to go over chapter one, just reviewing what the class is about and talking about organizational communication, approaches, and processes. Let's begin. All right, so usually in my lectures, we just go over the slides, and then I just pretty much put the slides into perspective. I have to move myself around a lot. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this class is about. We're going to talk about how the world is complicated by globalization, global security, climate change, and changing demographics. Understand the concept of requisite variety and its increasing complexity of organizing makes it essential for multiple approaches to study and practice organizational communication. Develop and prepare and apply more complex thinking about organizations by considering a variety of organizational forms and the reality of the organizations are often paradoxical. Then understand the distinction between the transmission model of communication and the constitutive model of communication. And then finally, identify 7 conceptualizations of communication and how these conceptualizations can change our thinking about organizational communication. Oh, that was a tongue twister. Let's begin. Now, in this course, because it's a junior level course, I want us to not only think about the theories that are going to be presented throughout the semester, but think about how it's going to be applied. Within about a year or so, you will be out into the world, graduated. And many of you are working jobs already. So I always want you to think back to organizations that you know. Where do I recognize this? Where do I see this? I took this class many moons ago, and at the time, it was just, okay, go ahead, take this class, knock it out, graduate. But now, as an instructor, thinking back on my experiences working in large organizations, smaller businesses, any entrepreneurial pursuits that I have, I think the value of this course is to understand how systems work, how organizations work, so you can be not only better informed communication practitioner, but just be better informed overall. So let's think about the theories, how they're applied, and the overarching content or overarching lessons that you'll get from this course. So, with that being said, think about how complex organizational communication is. Think about how social media has changed the game. Many of you have grown up with social media. I have not. So I'm able to see where newspapers and the TV news was our primary mass communication outlet. Now, in addition to those, we have different social media outlets and blogging and vlogging, all types of things. So even the channels in which we communicate has become more complicated. But in organizational communication, we have relationships, beliefs, family, work, politics, government, and global economy, and all these factors that the people within those organizations and the organizations themselves, the people that they have to communicate to, we all have to contend with. So it's not just like, oh, we have a press release, send a message, or oh, there's a tweet, or for instance, here's a social media post, boom. Okay, here's some information we need to disseminate. It's a lot more complex than that. And the organizational world is more complicated than it was in the past. So let's go ahead and explore that real quick. So globalization, we might have heard this term in other classes, but the globalization movement has led to practices such as outsourcing. So we have to think about the cultural norms of others, how they deal with us, the lives of the citizens from other countries, how certain countries being other countries, excuse me, certain organizations being other countries, how does it impact their economy, how it affects our economy. There's a lot of layers, but when we think about that, we can think about how the impact of globalization on American society, the cost of labor, try to think about all how all that impacts communication and the excuse me, and the perception of different companies. Globalization offers opportunities for entrepreneurs but challenges such as domestic job losses in America, or job losses in local economies. I am from Detroit, Michigan. So being from Detroit, Michigan, the main economic economic engine was factories, building cars. My grandfather made cars and was a Ford employee. So when those jobs left, it definitely impacted my city and thus impacted my childhood. So an organizational decision from maybe 20 years before my birth impacted my life in a way. So that's just one example. So what happens when jobs leave? What happens when jobs appear? So think about where Tesla sets up their factories, or think about, I believe, I want to say Apple might set up shop in another place, or the global giants, or the new powerhouses of today. So where they should set up shop can provide economic opportunities for people. It can provide uh, increase of salaries, but it may displace the people that are already there. The cost of living goes up. The opportunities may not be evenly dispersed among the citizens. So if you get what I'm catching here, or get what I'm saying here, it's a lot more nuanced than that. So globalization is not just about, oh, a company is just somewhere else. There's impact for those employees abroad and domestic as well. So when we think about globalization, here's some of the questions we can think about as we go along the semester. How can organization members communicate effectively in the contracted time and space of global markets? And how can communication be used to enhance understanding in the multicultural workplaces that are a crucial feature of our global economy? So we have to think about, if we are disseminating a message, think about how the impact of the local communities, and think about the verbal and nonverbal norms of said communities. So, for example, the intent of the message might be pretty innocent, but not understanding the norms of that society, the intent of the message or the reception of that message may backfire. All right. Some additional questions. How can communication processes in businesses, government, and non-governmental organizations be used to protect the rights of workers in the United States and abroad? Just making sure that as we move to different countries, as we interact with citizens of the globe, make sure that we establish ethical and fair practices for them as well. How does organizing occur in the realm of political and economic policy debates that are critical to long-term direction in the global economy? And how do corporations balance between providing goods and services at a price preferred by customers and providing a safe and economically secure workplace for their employees? And that is a balance that global companies have to toe. They are a business. They are there to make profit, but profit, or excuse me, with companies, they are serving people. People have needs, emotions, like security, and making sure they're treated fairly. And that's the balance that they tell. Next is global insecurity. So when we think about um, living in a global world, we must think about safety. So safety can include the physical safety of employees and the spaces that the company serve. We can also think about not only physical safety, but technological safety as well. So making sure we don't have viruses in the computers, shutting down the systems, or making sure we don't have unsafe practices where they're taking the money out or stealing from customers. So crime, global insecurity is a factor that companies have to think about. So terrorism is not specifically tied to ideology, but involves unpredictable violence, creating fear. So in a post 9/11 world, companies have to think about safety. War terror referred to the global counterterrorism campaigns, which meant increased military interventions, more complex communication processes, and messaging. and dealing with military personnel, their families. And with that global insecurity, it poses complex political negotiations, communication between government entities. So, because of this larger political space, companies had to navigate that, had to navigate the safety of their employees, making sure that they are respecting the laws of their citizens, making sure we're keeping each other safe, keeping that the making sure that they are ensuring the safety as much as the company can do, but working with local governments to do that. So with globalization in a post 9/11 world created these new complexities that they didn't really think about before. So scholars can address this by examining communication systems for border security, tracking terrorist activities, and first response capabilities. So when we think about organizational communication, we're not just thinking about companies, but we're thinking about governments and government systems as well, and how they're interlinked. Homeland security refers to organizational efforts in government to ensure safety and resilience against terrorism and other dangers. So, some questions that we have to think about in these post 9/11 times is how do terror networks and hidden organizations organize, recruit, and socialize memories across time and space? So, even though these conversations have taken a different form in the 20 some odd years post 9/11 attacks, we had to deal with digital attacks as well, um, in addition to violence as well. So, with globalization, we have global insecurity, and that is what organizations have to navigate and figure out with the political systems of each country, um, and the law enforcement of each country. Some additional questions for global security. What communication systems can we put in place to best ensure security? How can we prevent our fear of terror from being common fear of each other? So making sure we are not discriminating or being ethnocentric when having these conversations. How can we best deliberate like policy and make decisions in the changed environment in a post 9/11 world? How can communication systems be designed to protect and enhance well-being of individuals who serve as first responders? So remember, organizations, major systems. That's what we're looking for. Major systems have organizations within them, and with those layers, as exemplified in this question, how can communication systems help first responders? So think about this class as being multi-layered. And then we have climate change. So we've heard about climate change. We've experienced the effects of climate change as far as weather patterns. And because we are people on Earth, we have to be concerned about what happens on Earth. And organizations and businesses happen on Earth. So let's explore this a little bit more in the organizational communication context. Humanity's role in climate change must be addressed by governments, businesses, and individuals. And then there's need for mitigation and response efforts in the face of unpredictable mega disasters. So we're going from the people and globalizations and some of the risk involved with globalization and crime to actually the existential threat of climate change. So there's rising sea levels, shrinking glaciers, melting permafrost, and that threats ecosystems. Think about if you are a cookie manufacturer, right? You like to make cookies and you have this big corporation and you make cookies. That's what you do. Well, you think, hey, simple enough. What do I have to think about climate change for? Well, you have to source the wheat, you have to source the eggs, you have to source the natural resources to help you create that cookie. I like Oreos, so I gotta get cocoa from somewhere. And if the weather patterns mess with the supply of cocoa or the raising temperature mess up the cocoa plant, how am I gonna get cocoa to make my cookies to serve to you? So even in industries that you might think, climate change, that not going to impact them. Climate change impacts all of us. Then we have the unpredictability of climate change. So record cold, record heat, droughts, floods, wildfires, safety. So protecting employees and the actual physical organization, making sure that we're communicating safety measures to citizens, to the employees, to the people, to the shareholders, the people who have stake in the organization. How do we address the unpredictability, of weather patterns or tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes? That's some things that we have to think about. Even though earthquakes aren't caused by climate change, I just want to give an example of how to communicate during those natural disasters and those times, just to make that clear. All right. So, organizational communication's role in this conversation. We bridge the gap between scientific and public perceptions through effective communication. It's important. The scientific community is important, but of course, scientists are scientists. So, how do we break down the jargon, the ideas for the masses and the public to keep everyone safe? Evaluate organizational capabilities to handle disasters. It's not just about communicating, it's about, hey, what do we do? How to keep ourselves safe? How do we protect the interests of the organization? Opportunities for businesses to enhance environmental responsibility and build relationships with local organizations, nonprofits, people who can work together as community to help not only with just multiple problems, societal problems in general, but just to help deal with the problem of climate change. Some particular examples of going green, which is a strategic move for businesses. They might go green as far as changing their packaging or their ingredients that are more compostable. They might donate to organizations that help with climate change or environmental endeavors. For example, Patokia's environmental activism and strategic engagement department and department or committee will be able to not only communicate the company's dedication to climate change activism, environmental activism, but can help signal that, hey, we care about not only selling our merchandise, but we care about being a good citizen and contributing to the betterment of our world and society, which is good for business. Organizational communication must address complex questions of climate change and global warming. So that's the word we're going to be using a lot today. Complex, complex, complex. What we think is happening is more to it than that. There's levels to this. So you might hear me say throughout the semester. So how can organizations reduce and eliminate their contributions to global warming and embrace sustainable organizational practices? So we moved away from, okay, we're going to just pollute and do whatever we want to just in the name of profits. We're just going to produce, waste, styrofoam everywhere. We don't do that anymore. We want to make sure that we're responsible. We want to make sure that we recycle. We want to make sure that we communicate that we care about the environment too, as an organization. How can nations work together to influence climate change? So it's not just about recycling our water bottles or anything like that. We have to work together, both for profit, nonprofit, entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs, large organizations, small organizations, and governments alike. We all are all in this together. How can entrepreneurs address greening organizations as an opportunity for both profit and social responsibility? Social responsibility can equal money, and money is good for organizations, especially for those for-profit organizations. How can we do both at the same time? Super complex questions. How can local and state and international agencies coordinate activities to cope with human consequences of global warming? How could do organizations and governments speak to publics about the ways that energy policy and practices influence the environment? So not only are we or organizations trying to green up and clean up their act, but how can they influence us as individuals to do the same? How can organizations increase awareness about ways in which individuals can make a difference in influencing the process of climate change? So next we have changing demographics. So we're going from globalization as a whole, safety and criminal aspect, then climate change to changing demographics as a whole. So like in globalization, we're dealing with people. And when we're dealing with people, we have to deal with the holistic person and deal with populations and how we interact holistically. So in demographics, that is statistical descriptions of population characteristics such as age, race, income, and educational attainment. So we have to figure out how do we communicate, organize, and address critical problems that keep demographics and respect for those demographics in mind. Intersectionality and social movements, they do matter. Change demographics coincide with social justice movements, emphasizing the need to address systemic inequalities. Now, organizations necessarily didn't start in systemic inequalities, but they may benefit or at least work within that system that either perpetuates it or they just have to operate with those implicit, explicit norms that we have to deal with as a society. So being sensitive to demographics, making sure that we have diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies within organization, and just making sure that we're on the right side of history in regards to these things that are very important. But since this is 2025, a lot of these conversations are in flux. So companies specifically are deciding, okay, do we continue with these diversity, equity, inclusion strategies, or do we do away with them? And what are the consequences of that? Some people support the elimination of these practices, but some people embrace these practices. Some people are like, hey, these companies do away with these practices, we're not going to support anymore. And then other companies are like, yay, no more of these practices and strategies. So right now it's a mixed bag, but it's something that an organization has to really think about. Hey, what are our values and where do we stand? So we have changing demographics in the US. So not necessarily talking about global at the moment, but the US is projected to be majority minority by the mid 2040s and rapid growth in populations of those who identify as Hispanic and Asian. And then less than half of American households will include married couples, which will impact perceptions of work family boundaries. So our excuse me. So our changing society is changing how organizations operate and how do they communicate with these changing demographics. So you can't necessarily be an organization in a bubble saying we're going to do these things one way and we aren't going to pay attention to changing demographics because companies that don't change and grow might shrink and decrease. So we want to make sure to be aware of that, especially in organizational communication. The rural population has increased by 14%, and diversity in rural areas are increasing, and we are getting older. So 25% of individuals are expected to be the age of 65 by 2060. And I was born in 85, so that's going to include me as well. So if you're on social media a lot, and I'll admit I am chronically online because research, right? But we have the war of the generations. So when we think about, oh, millennials versus boomers and X's versus Y, and then we have Gen Alpha on the scene, what do we mean? We have the silent generation born between 1925 and 1945, boomers born between 46 and 64, Gen Xers born between 65 and 80, millennials, hey, born between 81 and 2000, 85 and a half. Then we have Gen Z born between 2001 and 2020. We got Gen Alpha on the back end. And I think we have, oh, I believe this year is the year of Gen Beta. But it's Gen Alpha, but Gen Alpha's over. Now it's Gen Beta. So watch out. But when I say watch out, I mean look out for the new generation. And it's exciting. It's really fun. The future's awesome. But we also have characteristics that are associated demographics. So when we think about marketing to demographics, my master's in marketing and communication. So I really get a kick about into studying demographics. That's really exciting. But boomers are the characteristics of them as a whole. Ambitious, team oriented, have work centric. Gen X are flexible, skeptical, more self reliant. Millennials, competitive, civic minded, and values diversity. And Gen Z, more entrepreneurial, progressive. We'll see what those characteristics will be for Gen Alpha as they enter the workforce in a couple of years, and Gen Beta. So, because this chapter likes to ask a lot of questions and think about the levels to these questions, let's talk about the questions that we should ask as far as changing demographics and organizational communication. So, how can we communicate with members of a culturally diverse workforce in ways that respect differences and help achieve organizational and individual goals? So that balancing that companies have to do. How do members of the sandwich generation, those who might be caring for parents and children, cope with the stresses of work and family concerns? So they were having these conversations. I was a kid, so I'm the daughter of boomers. And I've seen my own mom have to raise us but care for her ailing parents, her aging parents. And now Gen X and millennials are in that same generation. So how do we balance work-life balance and how to address or cater to the needs of the sandwich generation? What are the communication patterns and needs of individuals from different age groups? So remember, we have our silent generation, boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, then alpha and beta are coming to the scene. So as technology increases, as people age, middle age now, how do we have to change not only with each demographic, but as these generations age and grow up? Can we use communication technology to design virtual workplaces for employees in a variety of locations? I'm doing this right now. I am your teacher, but I am a part of the digital workplace because this is your classroom. This is my job. I am doing this right now. Um, so the rise of virtual workplaces, how does that change the workplace? Will that continue? Will that continue to evolve? Think about AI. What is that going to do with virtual workplace? So a lot of good questions. How do we make tough decisions regarding the roles of institutions and government supporting aging workers? Especially, there's some Xylogens out there working. And then boomers are the older generation. The elder generation slash middle age generation are Gen X. So upper Gen X or old elder Gen X are the elders, and then on the younger side, they're more middle age. Millennials are just entering middle age. Like I said, I turned 40 this year. If we're listening to this, 2025. Um, then we have young adults in the younger millennial years, and then we have Gen Z. So, excuse me, excuse me. So, as we grow up in our ages and stages, how how does institutions and the governments support our aging workforce? And as we move through our own ages and stages as well. What role does communication play in ensuring a level playing field for individuals with disabilities? And very good to know that with diversity, disabilities are a part of that diversity conversation. How do we better accommodate people with disabilities? Tying to the aging question, right? So, for example, the older you get, the more likely that you will be a part of the disability community. So, how do we accommodate, have fairness and an equal playing field to a traditionally marginalized group, such as people with disabilities? Now let's explore the WEX concept of requisite variety. So successful organizations group need to be as complicated as the problems they face. So with smaller organizations, solo entrepreneurs might be able to get away with not tackling the big problems because of course you have to have the manpower, you have to have the monetary resource to tackle on those big problems. But as you grow, not you, but you as an organization, you have to be able to meet the needs of these complicated problems and complicated issues and able to react, communicate with them. All right, so the theme of chapter one, which I think is pretty cool, is complicating our thinking about organizations. As junior and senior level students, we are not only thinking about theories, but we're also thinking about how can it be applied? What are some of the examples? What is my role in this as a communication practitioner? Or if you're not a communication studies major, you might be communicating through your organization through your job, or if you plan to become an entrepreneur and have dreams of becoming a large organization, these questions are still relevant. And they're definitely relevant as consumers. We are citizens of our city, of this state of California. We consume for we consume from different companies. Many of us are thinking about becoming employees for different organizations. So no matter where you are in the spectrum, right, this is relevant to you. So complicating our thinking about organizations. We want to think about, or the critical thinkers, excuse me, the critical features of organizations is social collectivity, or the collectivism of society. So we're emphasizing on the existence of a social group. So what are the groups? What are the needs of those groups? And how do we come together? The goals beyond economic objectives to call broader, more impactful goals. So earlier I was like, okay, well, the number one goal of a company is to make money. And that is true. That's number one goal. You don't make money, you're not in business anymore. But beyond that, we have to think about the population. How do we impact? What are the different types of goals that a company has? How do we use strategy to achieve those goals? Right? And then we have coordinating activities. So beyond traditional hierarchies, and it's definitely when we look back at those slides about generations, right? We work together, not necessarily as a triangle, but as a circle, like how each piece of the pie or each section of the organization helps bring the organization together and help us run smoothly. So how does each department coordinate activities together to make everything run? And think about different types of organizational structures. We're going to use the word organization a lot in this class. It's in the name. But considering various structures, including flat and time space transcending, so trying to figure out, okay, what are these structures? Does it work? Does it not work? And does it need to change as time goes on? Embedding in the environment, recognizing organizations with larger context. So organizations do not stand alone. They are in the context of a society, a city, a state, a country, the globe, just like we talked about before. So where does our organization fit in the larger scheme of things? And we'll be asking that question along this class. Bigger picture, where does this fit? How is this relevant? Okay. All right. And then, and I had to remind myself earlier in our lecture here, that when we think about organizations, we're not just thinking about for-profit companies. Oh, we are thinking about them, but we're thinking about for-profit businesses, non-profit companies, non-traditional organizations, service NGOs, which are non-government organizations, cooperatives, co-ops, and virtual organizations. So as technology and the idea of companies and organizations transform, so do the examples of organizations. All right. So finally, we're going to talk about our tried and true. I've been a communication instructor. I've also have experience in strategic communication through agencies and small companies. And I've taught this class for a while. And of course, alumna of Cal Poly Pomona and Cal State San Bernardino. So I've seen this a lot. First chapter never fails, the communication model. So important because we have a baseline of, hey, how do we send and receive messages communication? So we have our source, message, channel, receiver. So every time I teach a new class, I always laugh because this is in there every time. But with the SMCR model or the transactional communication model, it definitely, when you think about the model, it's almost like, okay, you have a person, have an arrow, slingshotting the message to the receiver that collects the information. And sometimes they might have feedback, sometimes not, but there are limitations to that particular model. So, for example, the supervisor seeking weekend volunteers through email, but they fail to recognize the intricate nature of communication. So they might not get the volunteers because they might have to talk to them in person, or if you want volunteers for the weekend, you have to think about people not wanting to work on the weekend. So just the source message model might not get the results that they want. So Robert Craig trans contrasted, excuse me, Robert Craig contrasted, there you go, the transmission model of communication with the constitutive model of communication. So the constitutive model produces and reproduces shared meaning. So we're kind of, remember, complicating a little bit. That's the major thing of this chapter in the class. Like, hey, how could we take this to another level? All right. So Craig suggested that we complicate our thinking and not stop at the simple choice between transmission and constitutive model. So we're expanding it a little bit more to domains of communication theory. So different ways and different aspects that communication works in the world. So not just like, okay, we have a sender and a receiver, boom, go ahead. Or yes, we do have to, excuse me, or we do have to process and produce and reproduce shared meaning, which is true, but can we go even further than that in communication? So let's go ahead and explore. All right. So here are the 7 approaches to the concept of communication, which I find really fascinating. We have rhetorical, semiotic, phenomenological, cybernetic, social psychological, social cultural, and critical. So now we're getting to the meat and potatoes of the advanced communication theory. So, for example, in rhetorical communication is the art of actual discourse. Think about your argumentation classes, think about public speaking classes, think about the classes where you are creating the information to share with others. So, in the context of this class in organizational communication, we can think about strategies of communication during times of crisis, not just in times of crisis, but how can we get the information as clearly and make the best impact as possible. But then we have semiotics. So think of semiotic, think of signs and symbols. So think of logos, for example. A logo, not only does the logo communicate the name of the brand, but the feelings that are associated with said brand and what it's associated with. So it's the intersubjective mediation of signs. So it studies the ways that organizations can create and sustain identity through corporate symbolism. With phenomenological communication, it's the experience of others and dialogue. So we're going to talk about conflict resolution in organizations. and using dialogue to mediate conflict between two employees. Then we have cybernetic information processing. We're finding optimal ways to set up a communication network and systems for employees to excuse me, for employees who telecommunicate. So let's try that again. I was interrupted for a second, but let's go back to cybernetic cybernetic communication. So it's information processing, finding optimal ways to set up a communication network system for employees who telecommute. So this is actually that technological process is how do we use technology to communicate effectively with our employees, with people who we serve through our organization, and just making sure everything's running smoothly. Then there's socio-physiological expression, interaction, influence, using knowledge about personality and interaction style to improve conflict management programs, but making sure that we're understanding individual in the organization and how do we influence people, leadership strategies, employee relation strategies, etc. Then we have social cultural. So the production or reproduction of social orders. So we're examining intersectionality in this case of organizational, national, and ethnic cultures in multinational organizations. And finally, critical, so discursive reflection. How can we be better? What are some of the things that aren't going right in organization, and how can we improve and make change? So, for some examples, confronting the issue of sexual harassment in the workplace through programs designed to shift beliefs about gender and power. So with these 7 approaches, we are making a very simple, let me go back to the slides, simple SMCR model and making it a little bit more complicated. But although it's a little bit more complicated when you think about or break it down into pieces, our discourse, mediation by signs, appearance of otherness, information processing, expression to interaction influence, reproduction of social order, and discourse of action. Breaking it down isn't as hard as it may seem. We're breaking it down like, hey, we're finding the more nuance and the complications of organization communication because the world and organization communication is a little bit more complicated. But we're going to break it down this semester. All right. So thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to learning your opinions about this complicated world of organization communication and break it down what that means for us as a society and as for communication practitioners or for those of us who might not be in communication majors, but how you're going to use this information one day. All right. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day. Bye, everyone.